What mysteries lay hidden beyond the known maps of the medieval world, waiting to be unveiled? What secrets were whispered in tongues so utterly alien that their very sound would shatter the understanding of any scholar confined to the familiar cadences of Latin or Greek? For a learned mind in the 12th century, steeped in the venerable texts of Rome and the subtle philosophies of Athens, the challenge of mastering certain languages would have been monumental. It was a time when knowledge traveled slowly, often through arduous journeys or fragmented manuscripts. Imagine a scholar, perhaps, from Bologna or Oxford, eager to bridge the vast chasms of geography and culture. Which languages would truly test their very sanity, demanding a complete rewiring of their intellectual framework? Number 1. Old Korean. The scholar, perhaps named Alaric, who spent his days poring over dusty Latin codices in a quiet scriptorium, might have heard faint whispers of lands far to the east. These were tales of empires beyond the Silk Road, of strange customs and even stranger words. The idea of learning Old Korean, a language spoken on a distant peninsula, would not have been a mere academic pursuit for Alaric. It would have been an endeavor bordering on the impossible, a journey into linguistic darkness without a single torch. The first immediate wall Alaric would crash into was the writing system itself. Old Korean, unlike the familiar Latin alphabet, did not possess its own native script during much of the medieval period. Instead, it wrestled with Chinese characters, known as Hanja, in a complex and maddening embrace. Imagine attempting to write your own language using the characters of a completely different tongue, not just for meaning but also for sound. Scholars in Korea developed systems like Aidu, Hyanko, and Gugyil. Alaric, accustomed to his 23 Latin letters, would stare in bewildered horror at thousands of Hanja characters. Each character, a tiny, intricate drawing, held its own history, its own layers of meaning, its own specific stroke order. There was no phonetic consistency. A character used to represent a syllable in Aidu might have a completely different pronunciation and meaning when used as a logogram for its original Chinese sense. Hyangal, for instance, took Chinese characters and used some purely for their phonetic value to represent Korean syllables, while others were used for their semantic meaning. Think of trying to write English using Egyptian hieroglyphs, sometimes drawing a bird for the sound B, and other times drawing a bird to mean bird. A sentence like, "The scholar writes a book," would become a visual puzzle, a blend of symbols whose origins lay in a language utterly alien to Korean, yet now forced to serve its purpose. Alaric, with his quill and parchment, knew about Greek script, perhaps even some Hebrew. But these were alphabets. Hanja was a universe of its own, a labyrinth with no discernible entrance for a Western mind. He would not only need to learn to recognize thousands of these characters, but also understand which function they served in a given Korean sentence, phonetic, semantic, or a mixture of both, and then how they related to a word in Korean. The sheer memorization required the visual distinction between hundreds of similar-looking characters would have been a task without parallel in his experience. Then came the sounds. If by some miracle Alaric could decipher the written forms, how would he pronounce them? The phonology of Old Korean, reconstructed by modern linguists, was a world away from the familiar Romance or Germanic sounds. He might have encountered retroflex consonants, sounds made by curling the tongue back, or perhaps a system of tones where the pitch of a word changed its meaning. Words like ma could mean horse, hemp, or mother, depending on the tone. His Latin, with its relatively simple 5 vowels and a straightforward consonant system, offered no parallel. The idea that a subtle shift in vocal pitch could change the very fabric of a word's meaning would be a conceptual hurdle. He might produce a sound perfectly, yet deliver the entirely wrong meaning, simply because his voice did not rise or fall at the correct moment. Imagine attempting to communicate complex philosophical ideas or even basic greetings when a single misplaced vocal inflection could lead to utter confusion or accidental insult. The subtleties of articulation, the precise placement of the tongue, the tension in the vocal cords, these were not skills nurtured by rote recitation of Latin declensions. The grammar of Old Korean presented another monumental challenge. It was an agglutinative language. This meant that instead of using prepositions or changing word endings in the way Latin did for cases and conjugations, Old Korean glued suffixes onto the ends of nouns and verbs. For instance, a single verb stem could have dozens, even hundreds of different endings, each indicating a specific tense, mood, aspect, honorific level, or speech style. Alaric was accustomed to Latin's 6 noun cases, perhaps 7 if he included the vocative. Old Korean, while not having cases in the Latin sense, had a dizzying array of particles that attached to nouns to denote their grammatical function, often with subtle contextual nuances. The idea of adding multiple distinct particles to a single word, each carrying a specific grammatical payload, would be entirely alien. Consider the verb system. Latin verbs changed their form based on person, number, tense, mood, and voice, a relatively predictable set of conjugations. Old Korean verbs, however, were a universe of endings. Imagine one verb stem, say, to go, could be followed by a suffix indicating that the speaker is speaking formally to a superior, another suffix indicating it happened in the past, another for a question, another for a suggestion, and these suffixes could stack up. The very concept of honorifics, where the language itself changed based on the social hierarchy between the speaker, the listener, and the subject of the sentence, was completely foreign to Alaric. In Latin, one might use respectful titles, but the grammar itself remained largely the same. In Old Korean, speaking to a king versus a peasant, or even just speaking about them, required entirely different grammatical structures and vocabulary. This meant a scholar not only had to master the rules of the language, but also the intricate social norms of a distant society just to form a grammatically correct and appropriate sentence. The vocabulary itself was a vast ocean, largely unrelated to any European tongue. While some Chinese loanwords existed due to centuries of cultural exchange, the core vocabulary of Old Korean was distinct. Smina categories might be divided differently. Concepts central to Korean thought, rooted in Confucianism or Buddhism as interpreted in Korea, might not have direct equivalents in the Latin intellectual tradition. For Alaric, building a lexicon would be like building a bridge across a chasm, plank by plank, without any known anchors on the other side. There were no cognates, no familiar roots to latch onto, none of the shared Indo-European heritage that might offer a faint glimmer of recognition even in a distant Germanic dialect. The most crippling obstacle, however, was the utter lack of resources. For a medieval European scholar, how would one even begin? There were no Old Korean grammars written in Latin, no Korean Latin dictionaries, no bilingual texts beyond perhaps rare, fragment diplomatic records that were likely undecipherable anyway. There were no native speakers in Europe to act as tutors, no traveling merchants who might offer a few phrases. To learn Old Korean, Alaric would have had to embark on a perilous, multi-year journey across continents, through deserts and mountains, facing unknown dangers simply to reach Korea. And even then, he would arrive without a single word of the language, needing to find someone willing and able to teach him from scratch, without any shared linguistic framework, using perhaps gestures and simple drawings. The cultural chasm alone, the vast difference in worldview, religion, and social structure, would have been a barrier as formidable as any linguistic one. A scholar, dedicated to the preservation and interpretation of ancient texts, would find no such texts accessible. The very idea of learning Old Korean in a medieval European context was a fantastical dream, a linguistic Mount Everest with no maps, no ropes, and no fellow climbers. Number 2. Picture a scholar in the medieval Latin West, perhaps Brother Thomas, whose days were meticulously ordered by the canonical hours and the copying of illuminated manuscripts, his intellectual world was bounded by the philosophical debates of Paris and the theological discussions of Bologna. The very notion of a language from the Caucasus, a land of rugged mountains and ancient kingdoms, would have been as remote as the stars. Georgian, with its peculiar script and formidable grammar, would have been an enigma, a linguistic fortress with walls unbreachable. The first visual shock for Brother Thomas would be the Georgian script known as Mkhedruli. It bears no resemblance to the Latin alphabet, or even Greek, or Cyrillic. It is a flowing, almost circular script, utterly unique. Imagine encountering an alphabet where every letter is a completely new design, with no upper or lower case, and each stroke must be learned precisely. The letter Ger, for instance, looks like a graceful loop with a tail, not a G or a gamma. The letter K is a sharp, almost cursive angle, not a K or a kappa. There are 33 letters in Mkhedruli, a number manageable enough if the shapes were familiar, but these were utterly alien. Brother Thomas, skilled in the painstaking art of calligraphy, would find his practiced hand unable to form these shapes. The visual memory required to distinguish between similar-looking characters, the muscle memory to reproduce them on parchment, would demand a complete re-education of his eye and hand. He might see the written words as artistic squiggles, beautiful in their own right, but conveying no meaning. Then came the sounds that would contort Brother Thomas's European tongue. Georgian phonology includes a series of getive consonants. These are sounds produced by building up pressure behind a glottal stop and then releasing it suddenly, like a pop. Imagine trying to say put or k, but with a distinct sharp expulsion of air that changes the very nature of the sound. Latin had no such sounds. English has them, but not as distinct phonemes. For Brother Thomas, learning to distinguish between a regular P and an adjective would be a constant struggle. His ears trained to the smoother consonants of Latin would likely perceive them as the same or at best as odd variants. Beyond the adjectives, Georgian is notorious for its formidable consonant clusters. Imagine words like gavriksk, skevna, meaning you peel us. 4 consonants clustered together at the beginning, followed by a vowel, then another 4 consonants. Brother Thomas, accustomed to Latin's clear consonant-vowel patterns, would find himself gasping for breath trying to articulate such sequences. His European mouth muscles, accustomed to simpler structures, would tie themselves in knots. The sheer physical effort required to pronounce words would be exhausting, a constant reminder of the alien nature of the sounds. The rhythmic flow of Latin prose, with its clear syllables, would be replaced by a linguistic landscape of dense, impenetrable sound blocks. The grammar of Georgian would have been a dizzying journey through a linguistic funhouse. It is an agglutinative language, meaning it adds many prefixes and suffixes to a single root word to express complex meanings. But more than that, Georgian verbs are famously complex. They don't just agree with their subject in person and number. Like in Latin, they can also agree with the direct object and the indirect object simultaneously. This system is known as polypersonal agreement. Imagine a single verb form that encodes who performed the action, who received the action, and who benefited from the action, all within its various prefixes and suffixes. For example, a Latin scholar knew that amo meant I love. In Georgian, the verb for love might have a specific prefix for I, a suffix for you as the object, and another suffix for the tense. And then, depending on the tense, the grammatical case of the subject and object might even shift. This is known as ergative-absolutive alignment, a concept utterly foreign to Alaric's Latin which uses a nominative-accusative system. In some tenses, the subject acts like an object in terms of its grammatical marking. This would be like saying, "I was loved by me," instead of "I loved," but with the grammatical markers on the verb itself shifting. The very framework of subject and object would become fluid and confusing. Furthermore, Georgian verbs have preverbs, prefixes that indicate direction. One verb might mean to go, but with different preverbs, it could mean to go out, to go in, to go down, to go up. These were not separate words, but integral parts of the verb form. Concept of screeves, a series of verbal forms that express tense, aspect, and mood in highly specific ways, would add another layer of complexity. Brother Thomas was familiar with past, present, and future tenses, perhaps a subjunctive. Georgian verbs have many more, each with its own intricate set of rules and agreements. The vocabulary, like the script, offered no handholds for a European. While some loanwords existed from Persian, Arabic, or Greek due to historical interactions, the core of the Georgian lexicon was distinct. There were no shared Indo-European roots to latch onto, no familiar cognates to offer a hint of meaning. Building a vocabulary would be a pure act of memorization, word by unfamiliar word, a stark contrast to the way Latin loanwords peppered European languages. The ultimate barrier, of course, was access. In the medieval period, Georgia was a distant Christian kingdom, but largely isolated from Western Europe. No grammars, no dictionaries, no bilingual texts would have reached the libraries of the West. No Georgian speakers traveled to England or France to teach their language. To learn Georgian, Brother Thomas would have had to embark on a perilous overland journey through territories controlled by various, often hostile powers, across mountains and deserts, simply to reach Georgia. Even then, he would arrive without a single means of communication, needing to find a monastic order or benevolent courtier willing to host and teach him. The sheer physical and intellectual isolation would have made Georgian learning a true miracle. Its unique culture, its ancient form of Christianity, its distinct literary tradition, like the epic poem The Knight in the Panther's Skin by Shota Restavelli, all would have remained closed books, their meaning locked behind the formidable linguistic and geographical barriers. Number 3. Coptic. Let us imagine Eleanor, a brilliant nun from a Benedictine abbey who devoted her life to transcribing ancient texts and delving into theological debates. Her world was rich, with Latin patristic writings and translations of Greek philosophical works. She might have heard whispers of the early Christian communities in Egypt, perhaps even seen some beautifully illuminated Coptic manuscripts imported by merchants. But the language contained within those pages, Coptic, the final stage of ancient Egyptian, would have been a linguistic puzzle of astonishing difficulty, a living echo of a language that once spoke through hieroglyphs. Coptic script itself would present a striking visual difference from Eleanor's familiar Latin. Coptic largely adopted the Greek alphabet, but it incorporated 7 additional characters derived from Demotic, an earlier Egyptian cursive script to represent sounds not found in Greek. While the Greek letters might offer a faint glimmer of familiarity, those 7 extra characters would be a distinct hurdle. They looked like nothing in Latin or Greek and represented sounds unique to Egyptian. More than that, Coptic, unlike Latin, was written with vowels as full letters, which was a step up from earlier Egyptian scripts. However, it lacked spaces between words in its earliest forms, or used them inconsistently, creating a continuous flow of letters that Eleanor would struggle to segment into individual words. Her eyes, trained to the clear word boundaries of Latin, would see a dense wall of text, a continuous string of letters without natural breaks. The sounds of Coptic, while influenced by Greek, still retained a distinct Egyptian character. Eleanor would encounter sounds like the glottal stop a sudden closure and release of the vocal cords, common in Coptic, but not a distinct phoneme in Latin. She might also struggle with certain pharyngeal sounds, produced deep in the throat, which are common in Semitic languages like Arabic, but utterly absent from European tongues. While some dialects of Coptic have simplified phonetic systems, others retained complexities that would challenge a Western ear. The rhythm and intonation, the stress patterns, would be different from the measured cadences of liturgical Latin. Imagine trying to discern the exact pronunciation of ancient theological treatise, knowing that a slight mispronunciation might alter the meaning of a sacred word. The grammar of Coptic, though in its later stages it became more analytic than ancient Egyptian, still posed significant challenges. Unlike Latin, which relies heavily on inflection, changing word endings for grammatical function, Coptic often uses separate particles and words to express tense, aspect, mood, and other grammatical relations. For instance, instead of a single verb form like hemat, he loves, Coptic might use a subject pronoun followed by a tense marker, followed by the verb stem. This might seem simpler, but the system of clidic pronouns, small, unstressed words that attach to other words, often expressing subject or object, would be bewildering. A single Coptic word could consist of a preposition, a clitic pronoun, and a noun all fused together. Coptic also distinguished between definite and indefinite nouns with specific articles, much like English. The way these articles interacted with other particles, especially in complex sentences, created intricate patterns. The verb system, while not as highly inflected as Latin, had a rich array of constructions to convey nuances of time, completion, and modality. A scholar like Eleanor, used to the clear paradigms of Latin verbs, would find the Coptic system of auxiliaries and particles a different kind of labyrinth. The rules for forming questions, negations, and relative clauses would rely on structures completely unlike those in Latin, demanding a total mental realignment. The vocabulary of Coptic was a fascinating blend of ancient Egyptian roots, enriched by centuries of Greek influence, and later some Arabic loanwords. Eleanor, accustomed to the semantic precision of Latin theological terms, would find the Coptic lexicon a unique challenge. Many words had distinct, layered meanings, stemming from their ancient Egyptian origins, now repurposed for Christian theology. Concepts like soul, spirit, or resurrection might be expressed using terms with long, complex histories in Egyptian pagan thought, now imbued with new Christian significance. This required not just learning new words, but understanding the cultural and historical baggage each word carried. She would encounter ancient Egyptian words like not for God, completely unrelated to deus. The sheer number of words and the subtle semantic shifts would be daunting. Profoundest barrier for Eleanor, however, would be the sheer inaccessibility of Coptic learning in medieval Europe. No monastic library in France or Germany would house a Coptic grammar or a Coptic Latin dictionary. No itinerant Egyptian monk would journey across the Mediterranean to teach the language in a European university. To learn Coptic, Eleanor would have to undertake a perilous journey to Egypt itself, a land far removed from the Catholic West, culturally and politically. She would need to find a Coptic monastery, a community of monks, preserving the language through their liturgical practices. Even then, she would arrive without any shared linguistic framework, needing to learn from scratch by immersion through gestures and repetition. The sacred texts she yearned to read would remain locked behind a triple barrier of foreign script, alien phonology, and complex grammar, with virtually no guides to assist her. The living Coptic communities, remnants of ancient Egypt's linguistic legacy, were a world apart from the European scholarly landscape. Number 4. Sanskrit. Imagine a scholar, let us name him Bartholomew, a master of logic and rhetoric, who spent his days dissecting the intricate arguments of Aristotle translated into Latin, or plumbing the depths of Augustine's theology. His mind was finely tuned to the precise inflections of Latin, the careful arrangement of clauses, the nuanced meaning of Greek philosophical terms. For Bartholomew, the very idea of Sanskrit, a language from the distant fabled land of India, would have been like trying to grasp starlight. Complexity would not merely challenge his intellect, it would dismantle his very understanding of how language could be constructed. The initial hurdle, the very first visual barrier, was the Sanskrit script, often Devanagari. Bartholomew was familiar with the Latin alphabet, a clear, linear system of distinct letters. Devanagari, however, is an abugida, a semi-syllabic writing system. This meant that each consonant character inherently carried a specific vowel sound, usually A, and other vowels were indicated by adding diacritics, small marks, above, below, or beside the main character. For Bartholomew, accustomed to consonants and vowels as separate equal entities, this was a fundamental rewiring of visual perception. Furthermore, when consonants clustered together, they often formed complex ligatures, merged shapes that could be difficult to recognize, appearing as a single intricate symbol instead of distinct letters. Imagine writing Saint not as two letters, but as a single, unique symbol. Reading a page of Sanskrit would be like deciphering a series of complex, intertwined glyphs, each demanding careful attention to its minute variations and diacritical marks. The script flows from left to right, but its visual density and the sheer number of unique ligatures would make Latin look like childish scrawl. If Bartholomew somehow managed to decipher the script, the sounds of Sanskrit would present a formidable challenge. Sanskrit boasts one of the most meticulously developed phonological systems known, a system that would make Latin's sounds seem utterly basic. Distinguishes between dental consonants, like the T in tree, retroflex consonants, like the T in butter where the tongue curls back, and palatal consonants, like the chi in church. Latin had nothing like this level of fine distinction. Sanskrit also features voiced aspirated consonants, like ba or dh, which are pronounced with a puff of air. Bartholomew, accustomed to simple B and D sounds, would struggle to produce and distinguish these. His European ear, trained to broad categories, would struggle to discern the subtle yet critical differences in articulation. But the true terror, the aspect that would drive Bartholomew to the brink of despair, was the phenomenon of sandhi. This is not just about pronunciation. It's about how sounds change at word boundaries, not just within a word, but between words. The last sound of one word would combine with the first sound of the next word to form an entirely new sound, often leading to complex transformations. For instance, a word ending in M might change to N before a word starting with tu, or a vowel might become a glide before another vowel. This meant that the actual pronunciation of a word depended on its neighbors, and its written form might not directly reflect its original isolated pronunciation. Bartholomew, used to Latin words standing as distinct phonetic entities, would find himself grappling with a linguistic chameleon where words shifted their very sounds based on context. The grammar of Sanskrit was an unparalleled Everest of complexity for a medieval scholar. It is one of the most highly inflected languages in the world, even more so than Latin. Latin nouns had 6 or 7 cases. Sanskrit has 8. Nominative, accusative, instrumental, dative, ablative, genitive, locative, and vocative. Each of these cases had different endings depending on the noun's gender: masculine, feminine, neuter, and number: singular, dual, plural. Concept of a dual number, for 2 items separate from singular and plural, was absent in Latin and would require a new conceptualization. The verb system was even more intricate. Sanskrit verbs have many different tenses and moods, but also different classes of verbs, each with its own specific patterns of conjugation. There were different voices, active, middle, passive, and a system of complex root formations. Bartholomew, who painstakingly memorized Latin's 4 conjugations, would be overwhelmed by the sheer number of verbal paradigms in Sanskrit. Panini's Ashtadhyayi, an ancient Sanskrit grammar, is a masterpiece of linguistic analysis, but its intricate rules and meta-rules would be inscrutable without years of dedicated study and a teacher. Beyond the inflections, Sanskrit reveled in the creation of incredibly long compound words. 2, 3, or even more words could be strung together to form a single sprawling compound, often expressing complex philosophical or descriptive concepts. Think of a word that means having a face like the moon. In Latin, these would be separate words. In Sanskrit, they might be fused into a single majestic linguistic edifice. Disentangling the components of such compounds, understanding their precise meaning and grammatical function would be a daunting intellectual exercise. The vocabulary rooted in a completely different linguistic family, Indo-Aryan but diverging far from Latin's Italic branch, would offer no familiar landmarks. There were no cognates, no shared linguistic heritage to provide hints of meaning. The semantic fields of Sanskrit words often mirrored the deep philosophical and religious traditions of India. Concepts central to Hinduism or Buddhism, such as karma, dharma, moksha, samsara, would require not just translation, but a profound understanding of an entirely different worldview. For Bartholomew, it would be a lexicon tied inextricably to a spiritual and intellectual landscape utterly foreign to his European Abrahamic understanding. The practical difficulties for a medieval scholar attempting to learn Sanskrit would have been insurmountable. There were no Sanskrit grammars or dictionaries in Latin, no bilingual texts circulating in Europe, not even indirect exposure. No Sanskrit speaker traveled to medieval Europe to teach the language. For Bartholomew to even dream of learning Sanskrit, he would have to embark on a journey of extraordinary peril and distance across thousands of miles of unknown territory, enduring countless hardships, simply to reach India, and upon arrival, how would he communicate? The absence of any accessible resources combined with the extreme linguistic complexity and profound cultural distance would have made Sanskrit not merely difficult, but virtually impossible for any medieval European scholar. Number 5. Classical Arabic. Imagine Master Gerard, a scholar renowned for his knowledge of arithmetic and astronomy, who perhaps had encountered some Arabic numerals or a translated treatise on algebra. He understood that knowledge flowed from many sources, and some of the most advanced scientific thought came from the lands of Islam. The language of these texts, classical Arabic, would have presented Master Gerard with a monumental wall of difficulty, a linguistic fortress built upon concepts utterly foreign to his Latin-trained mind. First visual barrier Master Gerard would face was the Arabic script itself. It is an abjad, meaning it primarily writes consonants with vowels, often indicated by small diacritical marks, harakat, above or below the letters. These marks are frequently omitted in standard texts, leaving the reader to infer the vowels from context. Imagine trying to read Latin where all vowels were missing, and you had to guess if prete meant port, part, prate, or purity. Arabic also reads, from right to left, a complete reversal of Master Gerard's accustomed direction. 28 letters of the Arabic alphabet change shape depending on their position within a word, initial, medial, final, or isolated, creating 4 different forms for many letters. This contextual shaping meant that a single letter could look completely different depending on its neighbors, demanding a visual re-education. Then there was the art of calligraphy, where letters flowed into intricate patterns, often making individual letter recognition even harder. The sounds of Arabic would challenge Master Gerard's very vocal apparatus. Arabic possesses a range of guttural sounds, produced deep in the throat like the ain and gain, g, and the emphatic consonants, sad, dad, d, te, ze, se. These are pronounced with the tongue raised towards the soft palate or pharynx, often with a slight constriction of the throat. Latin had no such sounds. Master Gerard's mouth, accustomed to the simpler, more forward sounds of European languages, would struggle to produce these alien phonemes. He might attempt to articulate them, but would invariably produce an incorrect sound, potentially altering the meaning of a word entirely. The glottal stop, a momentary closure of the vocal cords, also played a crucial role, often appearing at the beginning of words or between vowels, a sound that in Latin was typically just a pause. The grammar of classical Arabic, however, was the true intellectual labyrinth. Its core principle is the triliteral root system. Most words in Arabic are derived from a three-consonant root that conveys a core meaning. For example, the root ktb conveys the idea of writing. From this single root, a vast family of words is formed by adding vowels, prefixes, and suffixes, or by changing the internal vocalization pattern of the root itself. Kataba means he wrote, kutub means books, maktab means office, kitab means book, katib means writer, maktub means written or letter. Master Gerard, used to Latin system of distinct verbs and nouns that changed endings, declensions and conjugations, would find this system utterly bewildering. He would need to recognize the three-consonant root, understand the various patterns or measures Ozan through which words were derived, and then infer the specific meaning of that pattern. This was not a simple matter of memorizing endings. It was a profound shift in how words were built and how meaning was conveyed. Arabic nouns, like Latin, have cases, nominative, accusative, genitive, but they also have two states, definite, preceded by al, and indefinite. Adjectives had to agree with the noun in all these aspects. Furthermore, Arabic had a dual number for exactly two items distinct from singular and plural. Master Gerard, accustomed to the relative predictability of Latin's declensions, would find the system of broken plurals a particular nightmare. Instead of adding a suffix like s or s to form a plural, many Arabic nouns form their plural by changing their internal vowel structure, completely altering the word's appearance. The singular kitab book becomes kutub. Books, not kitabs. There were no straightforward rules for these broken plurals. They simply had to be memorized, one by bewildering plural after another. The resources available to Master Gerard in medieval Europe would have been extremely limited, though not entirely non-existent. While most scholars in the Latin West had no exposure to Arabic in places like Al-Andalus, Islamic Spain, or Sicily, where Islamic and Christian cultures intersected. Some European scholars did learn Arabic. For the average scholar in Northern Europe, there were no grammars or dictionaries in Latin. No readily available teachers' texts were rare and difficult to acquire. Learning Arabic meant entering a distinct intellectual sphere, often associated with theological rivalry as much as scientific exchange. Master Gerard would have to travel to these distant intellectual centers, find someone willing to teach him, and navigate the cultural complexities of a different religious and social system. The cultural chasm was immense. Classical Arabic was the language of the Quran, of Islamic theology, law, philosophy, medicine, and mathematics. Understanding its nuances required a deep immersion in Islamic thought, a where-you, distinct from the Christian scholasticism of the West. Terms like jihad, sharia, hadith carried profound theological and legal meanings that could not be simply translated into Latin equivalents without losing vast layers of context. The rich poetic tradition, the intricate rhetorical devices, all embedded in the language, would remain largely inaccessible without years of dedicated study. For Master Gerard, Arabic was not just a language. It was an entire civilization, encapsulated in words. A civilization both intellectually alluring and profoundly challenging to approach. Number 6. Classical Chinese. Consider Robert, a studious monk in a medieval monastery whose world was defined by the precise structure of Latin grammar, the logical progression of syllogisms, and the clear distinction between nouns and verbs. He might have heard fantastic tales of the Cathay, or Serres, distant lands of silk and strange wonders. The very idea of classical Chinese, the language of those fabled realms, would have been a conceptual earthquake for Robert, dismantling every linguistic assumption he held dear. The most immediate and overwhelming obstacle for Robert would have been the script Hanzi, or Chinese characters. Unlike Latin's simple alphabet of 23 letters, classical Chinese employed thousands of distinct characters. Each character was a logogram, representing a whole word or concept, not a sound. There was no direct phonetic clue within the character itself for how it should be pronounced. Imagine learning English where every single word, house, run, think, blue, was represented by a unique, intricate drawing, and you had to memorize thousands of them just to read a basic text. Furthermore, the characters were not phonetic building blocks in the way alphabetic letters are. Robert, accustomed to sounding out words letter by letter, would stare at a page of Chinese text as if it were a complex tapestry of abstract art. Direction of writing also varied. Sometimes vertical columns read from right to left, other times horizontal rows. His eyes, trained to the left to right flow of Latin, would find no fixed point of reference. The sheer memorization required to recognize and reproduce thousands of distinct characters, each with its specific stroke order and radical components, would be a task without parallel in Robert's experience. A single character might contain dozens of individual strokes, each needing to be perfectly placed for legibility and correct meaning. The visual complexity, the lack of a simple alphabet to break down words into sounds, would have been an impenetrable wall. Then came the sounds and the concept of tones. Classical Chinese was a tonal language. This meant that the pitch contour of a syllable, whether the voice rose, fell, dipped, or stayed level, changed the meaning of a word. For example, the syllable may could mean mother, hemp, horse, or scold, depending entirely on the tone used. Robert, whose Latin had no tonal distinctions, would find this concept utterly alien. His ear, trained to the clear vowel sounds and consonants of Latin, would struggle to perceive, let alone reproduce, these subtle pitch variations. He might say a word perfectly, yet convey an entirely different meaning, simply because his voice did not follow the correct tonal pattern. Imagine trying to conduct a profound philosophical debate when a slight shift in pitch could change being into disease. The phonology of classical Chinese also featured sounds not present in Latin, such as aspirates or specific palatal consonants, which would further complicate pronunciation. The grammar of classical Chinese would have dismantled every single grammatical rule Robert had ever learned. It is an isolating language. This meant that words do not change their form based on tense, number, gender, or case. There are no conjugations for verbs, no declensions for nouns, no plural markers. The word for book is simply shu, whether it means book, books, of the book, or to the book. The word for to write is exi, whether it means he writes, they wrote, or I will write. Instead, meaning was conveyed primarily through word order and the use of small, uninflected particles. Robert, accustomed to Latin's rich system of inflections where word endings told him the grammatical function, subject-object tense, would find this system utterly bewildering. How could one distinguish between man kills tiger and tiger kills man if the words themselves never changed? Only word order provided the clue, and even that could be flexible depending on context and emphasis. Particles, small words, often without a direct translation, might indicate a question, a possessive relationship, or a past action. Their placement and nuanced meanings would be incredibly difficult to grasp without any direct equivalence in Latin. The very concept of parts of speech was fluid. A word could function as a noun, a verb, or an adjective depending on its position in the sentence. This lack of rigid grammatical categories would make Latin's clear distinctions seem like a bedrock of order. The lexicon of classical Chinese was immense, filled with subtle poetic and philosophical nuances. Many characters were compounds of other characters combining elements to create new meanings. Building a vocabulary would be a slow, painstaking process of memorizing thousands of logograms, each with its own associated sounds and meanings, and then understanding how they combined into multi-character words. There were no shared Indo-European roots to provide any comfort. Every word, every concept was new. The greatest hurdle, of course, was the utter lack of resources. In medieval Europe, there were no classical Chinese grammars written in Latin, no Chinese Latin dictionaries, no bilingual texts beyond perhaps rare, fragile diplomatic messages that might have been carried by adventurous travelers. There were no native speakers in Europe to act as tutors, no merchants who could teach the basics. For Robert to even begin to learn classical Chinese, he would have had to embark on an unimaginable journey to the distant lands of China, a journey fraught with peril and taking years even upon arrival. How would he communicate? How would he find a teacher? Cultural chasm encompassing completely different philosophical systems, Confucianism, Taoism, Buddhism in its distinct Chinese form, different social structures and different literary traditions would have made the language an almost impossible barrier. The very idea of understanding the vast complex literary and historical canon of China would have been a fantastical dream for a medieval European scholar, locked behind thousands of characters, a tonal system, and a grammar that defied all European logic.